pleasure to introduce John Chalcraft, who I will be hearing for again. We're having our last meeting, and he's going to speak to us on transnational activism or socio-political perspective.
Right, so thank you very much for having me and for chairing the session, and to Ian Sinclair and Rebecca and Brighton Centre. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will speak for about 45 minutes, and I want to talk about transnational activism and to say something about a socio-political perspective on transnational activism, and it's supposed to be a critique also of two sorts of possibilities on the left, which frame transnational activism either in overly materialist terms, inserting it very firmly and ultimately within the central category of capitalism or neoliberalism. That's on the one side, and on the other side it's supposed to take on this way of framing transnational activism that comes out of another tradition on the left, which has to do with making its central category discourse. So I'm going to try and speak about a socio-political perspective on this. So, and it refers to research that I've started. I'm sort of still in the early stages, and I'll tell you about some of the case studies, but they all have to do with the Middle East and North Africa. But I've worked. Everything I've done has been on the history and politics of the Middle East and North Africa, and I've recently spent maybe 10 years looking at contentious politics and social movements and the history thereof in that region. So just to begin with something that David Hume, the British philosopher, said quite a long time ago. He said something like, when you nothing is more puzzling, he said, to those who look at the world with a philosophical eye than the fact that the many consent to the few. And he goes on to say, yes, because government ultimately has an end, and that end is justice, and in fact the many have force on their side, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, is one way of posing the question of resistance. Why is it that the many consent to the few? And of course, it's a question that's resonated through many sorts of traditions since. There's this idea, particularly if in one version, especially a more materialist version of the Marxist tradition, where you have tendencies within the capitalist mode of production, whether they be the multiplication of the ranks of wage labour, whether they be the crises of overaccumulation in capital, or the falling rate of profit, or processes of accumulation and dispossession. You have these structural processes that should or ought to be giving rise to some sort of process of socialist revolution and class struggle. And when that doesn't happen, you get all sorts of surprise. You get a whole question, why isn't this happening? And then you have all sorts of elaborate explanations for why it's happening. But one of the things is that when it does happen, you get no surprise. I'm just thinking of the work of, say, Gilbert Ashkar on the Arab uprisings. For him, these were predictable, the Arab uprisings of 2011. These were something that, it's no surprise. People who knew about the way in which the relations of production were coming into conflict with the forces of production could have predicted this and should have predicted this. So that's one way of sort of dealing with that issue of surprise. Another is especially a kind of post-1968 French post-structuralist discourse theory, which is, 1968 didn't work, there wasn't a revolution. What's the answer? Why is it that the many consent to the few? Well, it has to do with the overwhelming power of discourse, the Althusarian ideological state apparatuses, and so on and so forth. And that's informed, the normalization that you get out of studies of Foucault and so on. And discourse works as a kind of overwhelming mechanism of social control. It's another kind of answer as to why this supposed revolution is not going to happen. But thinking of the research that I've done, it seems to me that it's better to invert the question. It's more thinking, because if you study the everyday life of popular sectors separatist, to use the word that came up in Argentinian Marxism in the 1980s. If you study, for instance, as I did an ethnography of Syrian workers in Lebanon since the 1960s, those who went backwards and forwards in their hundreds of thousands doing low-paid, unskilled labour, and built much of the construction of Lebanon. The surprise would be, how is it that they would have been able to get together the capacity for resistance? The surprise was not, oh, why are they not rising up against this exploitation? Because exploitation there manifestly was. They're stitched into an unequal structure of accumulation. But when you see the pressures on their lives in terms of sending back money for the reproduction of domestic communities back in Syria, in terms of the violence that's wrought upon them from above, and in terms of all the disciplines that those Syrian workers themselves impose upon themselves to be like the good employee, to work harder, to work longer, in order for it to be more temporary, in fact, because they're trying to save up so that they can have another kind of life later on. But there's no surprise about them consenting to the few. The surprise would be, how would it be possible for them to engage in some kind of creative recombination that would enable them actually to challenge the unequal structures within which they are? So my general view is that we shouldn't be surprised about the many consenting to the few, but we should try to be surprised when you do have actual challenges to the few by the many. That to me, anyway, is more puzzling. Maybe partly the key to it is not to look at the social with a philosophical eye, but to look at the social in terms of historical and empirical realities and how people live their lives and practice and so on and so forth. So, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a student in June 2010 in Egypt. And he's from Ain Shams University. In fact, he was studying Hebrew. He said, which isn't relevant, I met him in the headquarters of the Revolutionary Socialists. He said, how can we rise up? Every time we go on the street, there's about 150 of us, and we're surrounded by more members of the Central Security Forces than there are demonstrators, and at the end, they pluck us away like chickens. And in that case, he said, deposited us on the edge of the Pyramids Road, and then we would find our way back. He said, how, in this context, do we rise up? And I and others, of course, we're completely stumped. I mean, we don't have an answer. How could it be done at that moment, June 2010, in Egypt? How could this, I mean, when you go onto the streets in Egypt to demonstrate, you're faced, this is in 2010, you have the Central Security Forces, which is a unit of the Interior Ministry, are a paramilitary force. They have 350,000 employees. And that's only the physical wing of the Interior Ministry. There's also an intelligence wing. It's now called the National Security. And it also has 350,000 or something employees wholly devoted to manipulating and breaking up through, learning, through intelligence, through torture and other means, subversive political activity. So in this security state situation is not unfamiliar in the region. So yes, indeed, how are those creative recombinations possible that will enable resistance? That's the puzzle. It's a bit. I recently read David Graeber's book, Direct Action. It's a sort of wonderful ethnography of the anti-globalization movement in the United States in around 2000. But his thing is, what was so difficult was he has this interesting two categories. One, those who are alienated, those who are generally a bit more middle class, but they're alienated from the system, and those who are oppressed. And how do you link together those two constituencies? Especially because he said in the US context, in that movement, race always intervenes. And the sorts of tactics that are, the middle class white kids start to espouse get mapped onto whiteness. Whereas, and then you have debates about tactics that are actually about race, but it generates a very difficult and tricky quest for articulation between these two very different kinds of constituencies. And of course, I mean, it's what Michel Filippini, who's an Italian, works on Gramsci, speaks about, how are struggles articulated. I mean, one observation that's been made about 2011 in Britain was that you had three kinds of struggle. I mean, this is a year of the Arab uprisings, and you have the Occupy movement in 2011, you have the riots or the insurrections in the inner cities, and you have quite significant public sector protests. And the three sorts of struggles do not articulate. And one sort of slightly off-the-wall comparison with Tunisia in 2011 is that the struggles of different sectors, youth, smugglers, human rights lawyers, bloggers, unemployed men on the streets, they were able to articulate somehow. So anyway, this is just to suggest that this question of how struggles articulate and how this question around resistance, and I can't resist just mentioning, because this morning, as someone told me, Stephen, you told me this, the lawyer in the Giulio Regeni case, he's called Ibrahim Medlawi. It happened last night. He was going to Geneva to present a talk about enforced disappearances in Egypt. And he works on the case of Giulio Regeni, who's the Italian PhD student who was working at Cambridge, who was murdered by the Egyptian security forces in probably about the 2nd of February 2016. And so this case, Amnesty have developed this case in terms of rights, basic human rights around forced disappearances. But anyway, this lawyer was arrested last night by the Egyptian authorities, and he's disappeared. And we don't know where he is. He's incommunicado, but you can imagine. We know the sorts of things he's now experiencing, which is probably torture. So, but he's undergone forced disappearance. So, how in this? This is in the context of a transnational campaign in many ways. The idea of stopping enforced disappearances in Egypt, which has been taken up by Amnesty. This lawyer is heading off to Geneva. So, there are different articulations that are happening. But how do you achieve that in a context where the state can shut you down at the airport and throw you in prison, even though you're the lawyer working for the cause rather than the original victim, as it were, or the original rights holder? So these questions about how articulation can happen under these ferocious conditions, and we heard something about these ferocious conditions this morning, at least in the panel I was in. That's, as it were, a fundamental question around resistance. It's not the question of why aren't people rising up. To me, it's more the question of how do they manage to achieve creative recombinations? How do heteronymous subjects manage to forge new combinations of practice? You put together previously diverse, fragmented, scattered, segmented, and incarcerated forms and create sort of links. And of course, that question is very vivid in the case of transnational activism, because you have different national subjectivities and different borders and all sorts of other things going on, all sorts of challenges of, maybe they can be called challenges of articulation or re-articulation. So it's a way in to the question, at least. And I, in terms of this research I've been doing, I've been looking at the case of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement for Palestinian rights, and especially the case of Veolia, because Veolia, they managed to pressure Veolia into divesting from Israel by 2015 on the basis that it was aiding and abetting settlement activity through its 4 different projects that it had, especially the Jerusalem Light Rail in Israel and the occupied territories. And so there's that case, and the BDS movement, as we know. It begins in 2004-05, early calls from academics, sections of Palestinian civil society. They say, stop doing business as usual with the Israeli state until 3 sorts of rights have been achieved. I'll say more about that in a minute. But it grows. It starts from quite humble beginnings, but it grows very transnationally. And after about 2010, 2011, it has some high-profile successes. And then, you have kind of soft power has moved in against it in 2005-06 with all this stuff about how you mustn't delegitimize Israel. But after 2010, it becomes a cabinet issue in the Israeli government, and really quite significant resources are then thrown at it to try and to stop this kind of articulation across borders, which is represented by the BDS movement. I'm also looking at the case of the Mavi Marmara, which is that aid ship that came in 2010. It tried to break the blockade of Gaza, and it tried to deliver humanitarian supplies, but it was hijacked in international waters by the Israelis. I'm looking at that case as a case of sort of direct action, where you, and also the case of Giulio Regeni, which in in some ways, there have been campaigns around the killing of Giulio Regeni, the Italian student, as I mentioned, and it's been framed in particular ways, and they've, in some ways you might say at this moment, I mean, there's always more positive ways to look at it, but one way is, compared to, say, the BDS movement, which has huge traction and has scored some real successes, right now the Italian ambassador has just been sent back to Egypt in the case of the Giulio Regeni issue, and Italy is very much trying to recover business as usual with the Egyptian state. And the other case is about activism around the rights of migrant workers in the GCC countries. So particularly, the sort of 45 million South Asian low-skilled workers who are in those countries, but particularly I'm looking at Qatar and the UAE. So anyway, like I say, I'm getting started with this research, but I wanted to mention it in terms of the more general problematics that are thrown up by how we study transnational activism, but also activism in general. So to mention something about the approach, so my approach to this that I wanted to put forward as is a socio-political perspective. And so what is absolutely central, and this is thinking of like the central and fundamental categories of this sort of approach, it's on the one side it's not the mode of production, and on the other side it's not discourse. It's a sort of, it desperately tries to be anti-reductionist, to not reduce the phenomena at stake to either the mode of production or discourse or some mixture of the two. And in that, of course, it takes inspiration from Antonio Gramsci, the famous Italian interwar communist intellectual. But what's at the heart of it then are relationships and interactions between political logics and social logics. And that means, political logics around binding regulation and coercion and all of the state apparatuses that are involved in that, and the interstate type relationships. And so not seeing these apparatuses as either destined to wither away, as fundamentally unjustified, as in anarchism, or are not either something that's just an epiphenomenon of the mode of production. So, but viewing them as having some sort of reality and some sort of relative autonomy in their own right, and I think that's in the spirit of Gramsci. And it means that there's bound to be conflict and antagonism, to use that word of the clown move, around those structures which are coercive and engage in binding regulation, but they're not going to disappear, and they're not just a plaything of other forces, whether discourses or economic or capitalism as a mode of production. But it's the interaction and the relationships between these political logics and social logics, whether they be cultural or economic, above all, which matter. And that includes transnational types of interactions. So that's the sort of bare bones of a socio-political approach, and it does take a kind of a Gramscian view of culture and civil society. So, because Gramsci's interesting, because remember we've had two. Gramsci is famously thought of as a theorist of cultural hegemony, and it's partly following the 1917, where you have a socialist revolution. He's a committed socialist, but there's no such revolution happening in Western Europe. And but Gramsci's thing is, we should treat culture not as a barrier to the unfolding forces of the revolutionary proletariat, and not as a tissue of mystification, like a reason why the masses are not rising up. We should treat it as a terrain of struggle. We have to fight in what he said, the redoubts and trenches and earthworks of civil society. So that's how we have to treat culture and civil society, according to Gramsci. We have to use it as a terrain of struggle. And it's interesting to see this whole pattern redone in post-68 Western Europe and Britain, where you have, there's a failed revolution, as it were, and then there's one take on it. I'm following David Graeber a bit here. There's one take on it which is more Althusserian, which is the revolution failed because of discourse, because there's this whole overwhelming mechanism of social control which normalizes everything. and we can't get out of it. And then another take on it is more represented by sort of Jacques Rancière and MacLeod Mouffe, and it more hews to the question of radical democracy, and it again treats culture as a terrain of struggle, just like Gramsci does, and they take a lot from Gramsci, of course, but the idea is that you do hegemonic struggle for something, for achieving some set of articulations in culture. And you get that in Stuart Hall as well. But it's interesting. But anyway, the idea is that culture within these interactions between political and social logic, it's a terrain of struggle, but it's not a barrier to the revolutionary forces of the proletariat. It's not just a tissue of false propositions that support the system, like false consciousness or mystification or ideology, but nor is it some overwhelming carapace from which we cannot escape or re-articulate. But if culture is a terrain of struggle, then it has some relative autonomy. You can't reduce it to the mode of production. So this is the sort of general idea that I have in mind, a socio-political type of perspective. And it's, you can read it a bit in Stuart Hall. I mean, Stuart Hall is the founder of cultural studies, but he spent some time worrying a bit in his later writings about, okay, I've spoken about discourse and about culture, but what happened to politics? And it's partly this. It's the various kind of forms of depoliticization that can be attendant on discourse theory, which doesn't give us a place to stand or a place to judge, that inspire this sort of approach, a kind of a recuperation of politics, but as in a socio-political kind of way. But what that means is, if we talk about something, if we invoke neoliberalism, it's simply untenable to see it as the final, central, fundamental, systemic category from which everything else flows. So, neoliberalism, in this approach, if you look at it socio-politically, it's an ideology, it's a social class, it's a set of particular economic interests, it's a particular kind of politics. It's what Foucault, in that book, Birth of Biopolitics, it's a book which isn't about biopolitics at all, it's about neoliberalism. But he speaks about the Gesellschaftspolitik of neoliberalism, about what it means for the state. The state has to create the market, the state has to create the conditions for competition, etc., etc. So it's a tissue of thinking, and it's also, a set of. So it's a set of socio and political coordinates. I mean, just to concretize it for a second. I mean, in Syria, in contemporary Syria, there's a very useful analysis by someone called Haj Saleh. He's a very interesting intellectual who was in opposition. He was in prison for 15, 16 years. He was a communist. He went into hiding in the early stages of the Syrian uprising, he says, so that he could write without being killed or censored. And he has an analysis of Syrian neoliberalism, but he's attempting to explain the violence, the killing machine, what he calls the fascism of the Assad regime, and it's one piece of it. I mean, there's several pieces to it. There's an ideological dimension. There's absolute Arabism. There's a kind of an ideology of development and modernism which is secular, but it's not democratic. And then there's a specific class, a crony capitalist, new bourgeoisie who've made a great deal of money through all these connections with the regime, through certain specific aspects of economic liberalization, and who treat the rest of the population with contempt, and they see the rest of the population as being responsible for their own ills. But it's this kind of analysis where it makes sense to me. To me, it's a socio-political analysis of neoliberalism. It's embedded in a larger socio-political context, and it doesn't try to turn neoliberalism into a system that in some way creates a structure which then everything else has to respond to. So this I mean, the same is true also if we think of empire. This has long been a bugbear of mine, but thinking of imperialism, there's so many outstanding theories of empire and imperialism that link it to the capitalist mode of production. But in my view, and this is partly a long argument, how do you escape from modernist forms of teleology, etc. But empire, I mean, in its original form, it comes from, in the Roman time, it had to do with dominion by violence. And I don't know, how do you distinguish between the relationship between the United States and Europe and the United States and the Middle East in terms of empire and imperialism. I mean, in my way of seeing it, in the post-1945 world, it's a hegemonic relationship with Europe because there is no overall systematic, credible threat of armed attack from the United States in Europe, whereas in the Middle East there is and has been and has continuously been. And this is an imperialist relationship rather than a hegemonic one. And it's because of violence. It's because of violent dominion. And if you think about analysis of internal colonialism in the United States in the 60s, this had to do with race, and it had to do with those who are earmarked for state violence, and it was black people, African American. This was part of another analysis of slavery and so on. And it's also this book I mentioned, Syria: The Impossible Revolution, by Saleh. He says, he says what the Assad regime has become an occupier. It's become like a colonial force. Why? Because it carries out systematic violence against the civilian population using, air power and scorched earth policies. The massive destruction of whole quarters using barrel bombs and on and on. And you might notice that I'm picking on the example of Syria just because there's an issue with the anti-imperialist left and Syria. There's an issue over, someone like Vijay Prashad, I think is wonderful. I'm such an admirer of Vijay Prashad. But when it comes to Syria, he always says, well, I can't verify the information coming out of Syria. That makes me think of Chomsky when he used to say, well, that's what the American propaganda machine says when, when the informant is, brown or coloured or etc. or from a country which is an official enemy. We can't verify the information. We can't verify whether it was Saddam Hussein who gassed the Kurds in 1988 because, it was Saddam Hussein, but he happened to be a US client at the time. So we can't verify it, and so of course making comparison with Vijay Prashad, the US. Yes, there's a lot that is known about the what Saleh calls the fascist violence of the Assad regime. But if we don't take that politics seriously, if we see Assad as a bastion of resistance against US imperialism and full-throated neoliberalism, then if we see it as an epiphenomenon of a mode of production, then we're constrained to, in some way, not verify the sorts of violence that's taking place. But on the other hand, if we take an approach that sees the politics as having a relative autonomy and some sort of importance in its own right, then we can get out of that bind. But anyway, so I mentioned, so these categories of neoliberalism and imperialism I see as, I think they're complex and they're socio-political. And I expect, I'd be surprised if someone like, if you read into neoliberalism, everybody has a different analysis of what's most salient, whether it be the ideology of Hayek, whether it be a class struggle in individual countries. David Harvey partly keys to the idea of a class struggle in individual countries. And don't forget that whereas neoliberalism in Chile, it required a coup that was carried out by the United States, 1973. Neoliberalism in Egypt didn't require any such thing. Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt in his 70s, he turned to what he was called an opening in Fatah. Another particular instantiation of that sort of politics and economics, voluntarily, as it were. It was part of a deal to get back Sinai, which was all wrapped up in Egyptian nationalism. It's not as if... And so, anyway, on and on. I don't, perhaps that's not so controversial after all. But it means that when we speak about resistance to neoliberalism, then we're in a tricky situation. Because if what neoliberalism is not is a completed system that determines everything else, then see what I think happens when the problem with speaking about the resistance to neoliberalism is, superficially the problem is that you come up with a monolithic, often even West-centric version of what that resistance should be and what it looks like, and you have hindsight and you know what it's supposed to be and you dismiss everything that isn't, and on, and of course politics, ideology and culture and other things are put to one side, diversity, pluralism, histories, etc. But more specifically, what happens more theoretically is that, see, if there's a completed structure, then resistance, we then have to know the structure of the resistance in advance, if the system is already completed. And I think that doesn't square with what working approach to resistance, which is, I mentioned already, a kind of creative recombination of heteronymous elements that is, in fact, it's surprising. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning. It's not the surprise is when it happens, right? It's not the surprise is not when it doesn't happen, it's when it happens. And it's surprising in a kind of constitutive way because it's not already present in the structure. This is a sort of general attitude that I'm suggesting is part of this perspective, is that you can't derive resistance from the structure that exists already. It's a surprise. And because, there's all these debates about the Arab uprisings of 2011 and you have the media saying, oh my goodness, it comes out of the great blue sky, and then you have academics saying, no, there was a lot of activism before 2011. And of course, the academics are right, but it doesn't mean that surprising and dramatic innovations didn't happen in 2011. They did. And the thing is that the things that happen, they're passionate, they're unlikely, they're diverse, they're peripheral, and they kick off things. I mean, the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, the petty vendor who was, struggling to survive, and he was facing bribery at the hands of the police, and he was faced the indifference of the governorate, and he burned himself. This is not an instrumental and calculated action designed to kick off a wider process. This form of resistance is not, as it were, you can't say, well, the structure that it has in some logical way will oppose this structure. And then the young men who came to the funerals in those early stages in the peripheral towns of Tunisia, they're following all sorts of different logics. Maybe they feel obliged. If a loved one is killed in a funeral, you have to go to their funeral, or you're doing it out of defiance. We're gonna take on the police, and so on. So you have these passionate, unlikely, and diverse sorts of actions that then create ever wider spheres, and then you have this thing where actually the crowds physically take on the police. And that's why I mentioned the June 2010 conversation, because that never occurred to me or anybody else, really, as far as I knew. Nobody said as a matter of strategy in the Middle East and North Africa, I know it's a very sweeping statement, prior to January 2011, nobody said, don't worry, we can resist by physically taking on the police. Partly because it seems so ridiculous, because they're so well armed, and as I mentioned, the numbers and the fear and everything like this. But what actually happened, because remember there were all these plans circulating among the educated youth that said, we're going to do it non-violently, and we're going to hold flowers, and we're going to win over the police. But what actually happened is there was a physical confrontation, and the police were physically defeated. That's what happened in Egypt. And it happened in Syria, except that the Egypt moment, the Tahrir moment in Syria, comes in August 2011, when you have the squares of Homs absolutely filled with tens of thousands of people, but the army comes and it massacres them. And so that form of people power, when it confronts the military, is broken. But when it confronted the police, it was able to degrade them, and then all sorts of things started to happen. That the regime starts making mistakes, but anyway, just to mention this idea about physically taking on the police, I don't see it as part of a strategy. It was a passionate, unlikely, improvised. It came together, and then this idea of the people demand. The people demand to overthrow the regime. I mean, this is a complete fantasy land in the previous couple of decades of modern Middle East and North African history. The people demand to overthrow the regime. What are you talking about? Completely insane. And yet this was the idea that came together. So, in other words, to speak about, we have to leave room for dramatic innovations, new forms of articulation, and that creates new collective experiences, new forms of consciousness, and that's very much a figure of what resistance is. So it's not something that's already present in the structure. That's the general idea. And so I see the biggest problem with this sort of reductionist or materialist, historical materialist tradition is they want to tell you that the form of resistance is pre-existing in the structure. But not all of them. Like, look at Fantasia's work on workers in Detroit in the 1930s. He has this thing called transformational associational bonding, transformative associational bonding that happens in workers' strike action in Detroit in the 30s. Suddenly people find a new connectivity and they have new experiences, new identities that they didn't have. It's a bit like E.P. Thompson speaking about how the working class is present in its own making. It's a homologous idea to that. Anyway, but this is part of a stricture against the idea that by diagnosing power, by diagnosing the structure, whether you do it discursively or in terms of the mode of production, that will enable you to say what resistance is. That I suggest is a philosophical attitude that doesn't take into account the kind of dialectics and antagonisms and actual practices that take place on the ground, but that can give us, a glimpse of resistance. But then, of course, there's always this other vector at work, which is that resistance is creative recombinations get stabilized, right? They get... it's one thing for the people to demand to overthrow the regime, and that idea, a model for collective action, can suddenly infuse crowds in very diverse socioeconomic contexts. But it's another for to then develop a kind of an intellectual, political project around what you're doing, which is a structuring process, and that's another vector, and I think that's part of leadership, organisation, and so on and so forth. And I just mention it because I don't want you to think I'm fetishizing this moment of creativity and informalism, because the other vector of structuring a pattern of resistance, once it's created, is another sort of important feature. But anyway, this brings me on really to... I only want to make one real point here, I suppose, which is in the context of a socio-political perspective, I wanted to say, and transnational activism, that it's important to speak about rights. And this is especially because rights are often scoffed at in reductionist materialist circles because they're just sort of bourgeois trappings, or they're part of a kind of nefarious neoliberal plan in some way. I mean, there's much more to it than that, but just to skip over the details. Or they're a kind of a discursive production, rights. They're perhaps there's something fundamental about maybe Western, for instance, discourse that enshrines rights in some inauthentic way. But I think if we take sociopolitics seriously, then we've got to think about rights, because you have this, there's bound to be antagonisms if you have relations and dialectics and interactions between political and social logics. There's always going to be this question of force, because the political moment involving binding regulation and coercion, then you have, what happens with that? Then there's going to be warrants for, warrants against, there's going to be questions of violence that we were already discussing. What is violence? What is force? Or rather, what's legitimate and what's illegitimate, and so these warrants are going to be endlessly present. There's no mindless pattern of resistance. There's no sort of reproduction of the proletariat out of an economic structure, nor is there the idea. Remember Foucault's idea about discourse, that no one is the author of it. It's mindless in that sense. The figure of the subject is produced by signifying practice. So it's mindless in that sense, in my view. There's a disappearance of the agent, of course. It's a very common idea in post-structuralist thought. Well, on the contrary, socio-political interactions are never going to be mindless. But this idea of rights, which are somehow inalienable, that are fundamental, whether this comes from a religious tradition or a humanist tradition, or it's just an assertive, this sort of non-negotiable idea, I think is very interesting. I think partly it's interesting for two reasons. One, it those passionate and unlikely and diverse and uncalculated actions that you see in early rising activism, like in the Arab uprisings, the demands that are made they have this idea of you make a claim, you assert a right, you're right, it's my right not to be tortured in the police, it's our right not to be ruled by a gang of thieves, etc. So you have this kind of passionate invocation of rights. But then you have a much more, and this is the second vector, not the creative one, but the more structuring vector, where you have all sorts of ways of establishing rights in more continuous discourses. And we this has been quite a long project, and it exists. So there's this feature of it. But I want to say that you can't dispense with rights when we're thinking about transnational activism. And I do think the suture of the idea of the West, or the Western liberal subject and the Western sovereign subject, with this idea of rights, the way they get mixed together. People say, oh, you're demanding right. You have this trend in subaltern studies where you're re-establishing the Enlightenment subject because you're working with rights. I think very problematic, very ugly, very symptomatic. I see it symptomatic as a kind of a narcissism about the West and about an inability to ascribe agency to the non-West. I see it as a kind of Orientalism by the back door. But because part of it, of course, just ignorance of the history. I mean, I spent 10 years writing a history of popular politics in the Middle East and North Africa, and rights claims are very prominent throughout that history of those who make contentious claims before the state. So, but of course, with different meanings over time, contextually specific. For instance, Petition from the Weighers and Measurers in the 1870s in Egypt, it says, the role of the government is to give everyone who has a right their right. The word is haq, which means what is due to me. What is due to me? That's what it means in this 19th century context. There's something that's due to me, and you better give it to me. It could be money, or it could be a political right. But that's the word that's used now for human rights, hukuk, etc. And there's a long popular tradition of speaking in terms of rights and making demands in terms of rights. It's not the invention of a post-1945 liberal Western order. It's constantly intertwined with that history of popular politics. Shayla Ben Habib makes quite a good argument. In the midst of exculpating Israel from any wrongdoing, completely unacceptable, she also says, you have to distinguish between the kinds of rights that are about property, individual, and contract. These are neoliberal rights, and then rights that are about more collective goods, like freedom of association, freedom of expression, which are social and political. I think it's a pretty good argument. And just to be brief, in the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, for instance, it lays claim to three rights. This is at the core of its discourse: the right not to live under occupation, the right to return, and the right to live equally within pre-67 Israel. And that's the universalist basis of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. That's its demand, those rights. That's it. And I've argued elsewhere that it's quite important that you have this rights-based approach, because it enables, because partly it's linked to an institutionally disruptive strategy. So it's not linked to professionalized NGOs who aren't raising political questions and who have no popular base and who rely on Western donors. No, absolutely far from it. It's based on an institutionally disruptive strategy, but how do you include very broad constituencies across the planet to sign up to this idea? But when you have very multitudinous even subjectivities at work, well, you have a rights-based language, and you don't, for instance, divide on the one-state, two-state question. Very important, because then you don't develop a bigger political vision and a project. Why not? Because then you'll get into all sorts of divisions. And you'll do one other thing to the movement, which would be a disaster, is you would change it from being a matter of civil society to political society. Thinking in Gramsci's terms, you would become a political actor. And the BDS movement isn't a political actor, it's a civil actor. It acts to say, this is what states are doing and this is what they shouldn't be doing. And this is what we have to do to change it, put pressure on those states and the companies and entities who are linked to it. But so it's a very inclusive strategy, a framing device, but that's required for the breadth of the movement because you're having to take on very concentrated forms of power. So do that in order to achieve the breadth. It makes very good sense. But if you eviscerate rights, if you say, oh no, the rights discourse is just collaborating with neoliberalism, well, I think it doesn't work very well for this case, at least. Just to mention something about freedoms of association and expression. So you might think, oh, liberal freedoms, irrelevant, just adjuncts to the further development of neoliberal capitalism. Well, just to give a couple of reasons why it's not adequate to see it that way. I mean, if you look at the counter-revolution in Egypt since 2013, following a military coup in the Egyptian armed forces and sections of the judiciary, they've taken over the state and they're rebuilding a kind of security state in Egypt. It's very important to them to crush out freedoms of expression and freedoms of association. And just to take the case of the media, there's a big apparatus of state-owned and state-supporting media, but there's also an independent media, and those are they who have come in for systematic assault since 2013. They were under attack before that, but this is a very powerful adjunct to the counter-revolution. Partly this very important point, which isn't mentioned much, is that if you people will report on the corruption of the military, the Egyptian military has spent, it's radically increased its budget in the last 2 or 3 years. And of course the military owns already between 20 and 40% of the Egyptian economy. And if there was widespread reporting on its economic practices, its relationship to state finances, its corruption, that would be this is a threat to the Egyptian state because the military is trusted by huge sections of the population, but people do not trust corrupt politicians in Egypt, and so it's very important that you have this systematic assault on the media and on those who uphold those sorts of freedoms. And just to mention the case of the migrant workers in the Gulf, the one issue that nobody will touch is the freedom of association of those workers in the Gulf states. They're ready to do very cumbersome compliance procedures with anti-recruitment fees and other sorts of legislation on Saudi Island in Dubai. But what they absolutely will not contemplate is the idea that workers can associate freely together, i.e. combine in a union, which is and that's of course linked to citizenship rights as well. And so those rights, it's quite easy to dismiss freedom of association and expression. You often hear it but from this perspective of looking at it in terms of Middle East politics and forms of transnational association and activism, which can only operate through those sorts of freedoms, it seems to me to be important. So just to say, there's an interesting puzzle around when resistance can come about through the recombinations of previously heteronymous forms of agency, that it's interesting I believe, to pursue a socio-political approach to that, which embeds forms of binding regulation and coercion and state regulation within larger kinds of social logics, and that can generate a kind of non-reductive type of perspective, also in its interstate and transnational context. And so, if we think about neoliberalism and empire, we should think about it in socio-political terms, although that can be useful, and that the idea then is that we shouldn't therefore dismiss in that context the claims that are made by rights of all kinds, civil and political, economic. My view on this is, if you look at the liberal literature on human rights, you see that they really talk about just the most fundamental rights. Like this is Rock, Rees, Sickink, all these people who speak about the power of human rights, and they're looking at these very basic rights, very important, but they don't, but there are rights of, there are civil rights, there are political rights, there are socioeconomic rights, there are many different kinds of rights that people claim. One of them, just to end on this, because it's a case dear to my heart, the case of Giulio Regeni, one of the things is his right to pursue research, which is what we all do, of course, but which is systematically, we would be contradicting ourselves, if, especially me who tries to work in Egypt, if we didn't recognise that when someone is tortured and killed because they're doing research, and they're treated thereby as that's a threat to national security. So, remember, this is also a language. It's a worldview that this person, because they're doing research, they must ipso facto be subversive. It must be threatening. Why? Why do you want to, what are you looking into? Who are you working for? This is divisive. This is Western. That's what the Egyptian state says to Giulio Regeni. But if we're to be coherent, we have the right here to do our research. So if that's if one can speak about that coherently, we have to say that the right to research is just another piece of this. But speaking about it in a more analytic way with regard to transnational activism, that's the academic community's been pretty quiet on that. We haven't spoken about the right to research. The Amnesty frame it as the right not to be forcibly disappeared, a fundamental human right, as it were. Whereas, we could do more, I think, as academics to say, no, this is also about the right to learn about the world and to inform the public and so on. So there are other rights at work there. So, that's probably enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for just opening up the canvas for transnational activism, culture, socio-economic, political, everything. So, and that means having a much more engaging discussion on all those different aspects and how they intersect. So open to all of you. Yes, there's 1, 2, and 3. All right, let's take 3 questions first, and then
Thank you. So it's coming from I think I'm very positive about what you said. So it's coming from more a bit to understand a bit more. So one very short remark. So you amalgam a bit Foucault and Althusser, and I think that's mistaken because your analysis resembles a lot what Foucault has to say about the Iranian Revolution. And surprisingly enough, after that he comes also to the conclusion that rights should be salvaged again. So it depends what right. He's not talking about human rights, he's talking about the rights of the government, etc., rights that are inherently related to the fact that we're all governed by a government. But my question was that you seem to have this kind of understanding of power as unitary and static in a way. So it's about the fact that you've repeated a few times that discourse, by the fact that it completely constructs subject as unresistible in a way. But the point is that discourse or power are not all static and unitary. You could use certain forms in a way. What you could do is use certain forms of discourse against other forms of discourse. In that case, what you give as an example is precisely this kind of a use of the legal structure of rights against a neoliberal governmentality. So, of course, there's discussion whether it's helpful, okay, because neoliberal governmentalities in a way hijack the legal structures, but you could do things. You could use the religious discourse in order to oppose certain things in North Africa, which you can do in European secularized Europe. But you could use it as a discourse of resistance, for example, as in the case of the Iranian Revolution, as in the case of other revolutions that happened throughout the Middle East, where religion is used to resist. So there's no one structure of power which from within you cannot resist anything. So it seems to be like a bit too superficial in a way. This understanding of power.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of moving parts to the presentation, thanks. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I guess the question would be, and then I want to make a comment to make sense of the question. The question would be what you see the practical value of theorizing is. And I ask it for this reason. Whatever the faults of a reductive historical materialism, and there are better and worse versions of historical materialism, of course, read Marx's actual political writings, is not reductionist at all, but very much doing what you're doing, right? A very focused, nuanced appreciation of forces, things like 1848 revolutions or the Paris Commune. But one of the virtues of even a reductive historical materialism is it made things clear in a practical sense. I was at the Tate Modern just before coming down to Brighton. There's this great poster from the 1930s by a Latvian artist, and it's Stalin's Politburo leading all the workers of the world. It's a caricature. It didn't work out. But it's beautiful as a coherent political vision. Now, it was wrong and we can't revive it. But don't we need something to bring focus? I mean, there's a reason why there's a debate on the anti-imperialist left about Syria, because there's 50,000 different actors there. Not all of them plausibly supporting a politics that is emancipatory. And I'm obviously no expert on Syria, but even from a cursory glance, there's a lot of forces in play. So we have a transnational resistance, but you also have transnational reaction. Anytime something important happens, everybody's there. The Americans, the Gulf, the everyone's there, right? So what type of practically efficacious theorizing do you see possible at this point? That's a bigger question that you probably can answer in the next minute, but...
And Paul.
I really enjoyed your talk, by which I mean, of course I mean I disagree with it violently. I actually do disagree with it violently. I'm happy to disagree violently. I think your notion of culture in this sort of miasmic, multi-discursive, contingent culture, and this opposite of this reductionist materialism, I don't know where you find it, but I do. But it certainly isn't even in Lenin. Actually, where you find it is from actually people like Stuart Hall, and they're reading a Gramsci. But let's remember some of the better readings of Gramsci, Fascini, Thomas, actually talk about Gramsci being very Leninist. And if you read the notebooks against the writings from 1919 to 1923, they are very much, its political economy cannot be separated from culture. You mentioned Thompson. Actually, probably the most important cultural materialist is Williams. You might want to think about his definition of hegemony, a lived-in process which constantly needs to be remade, and in that remaking can constantly be opposed and is a constant clash, a dialectic in action. You might also want to think about his model of residual, dominant and emergent cultures, which actually allows you to map the forces from the past and the forces from the future, making incursions on disrupting forces of the present, and base superstructure, which isn't a determinate structure. It's a series of forces and pressures, and their institutional, and as you put, dialectic, which you're right to do so, their dialectical interplay. What's the implications of us disagreeing with that analysis? I'll give you one. When you talk about civil and political society, and that something shouldn't be seen politically framed but civilly framed, the whole point is first to actually show people that civil should be political, that it's not just down to the state to recognise or de-recognise rights. Properly, we are political society, the state is the instrument that should serve it. But instead, by reifying a civility beyond the state, we actually play into the hands of those who want to occupy the state and relegate our politics. So, I'm sorry, but I'm really extraordinarily not convinced. But I hope I haven't been too subtle.
No, yeah. So shall I take those?
Yes.
No, take them.
Three very
To
different.
disagree as long as we can do it productively, which it seems like we are, so that's fine. Okay, so just Foucault on Iran. Yeah, I don't mean to talk like Foucault on Iran. I didn't mean to reproduce that kind of language at all. I mean, I think he saw Iran as a kind of an eruption against the whole Western episteme. Totally don't see it like that. But there's really good work on this. But I didn't mean to come across like that, because I see it as, this is a big limitation on. I mean, it's a limitation on. It's a kind of a West centrism, even a France centrism. It's a Western episteme. It's built up. It's archaeological. It has antagonistic relationships with everything else. But then suddenly something erupts and it breaks it. And he didn't know much about Iran. It wasn't. Foucault's brilliant. But I didn't mean to reproduce what he says on Iran. But we could talk about that more. But I mean, we could talk a lot about the Iranian Revolution. I mean, we have to mention it because of the thing about religious resistance, which you also made. But the rights being salvaged by. I mean, I that's interesting. I like that idea. I haven't quite seen it in Foucault. What I think is revolutionary about Foucault is his capacity to unravel normalizing discourse, and I think that's the moment. That's the thing. It's he was able to stand outside and deconstruct, and that to me is a revolutionary impulse, and that's exciting. But then can we arrogate that to one or two intellectuals? You know, what about, you know, so you know, there is a trend whereby you get one or two people who can pierce the veil of discourse, you know, Spivak and a few others, and everyone else is left, you know, repeating Western subjectivity or something, you know. And so I you know, but maybe I should rewind. I know there is this argument about Foucault 2.0, and I just don't quite see how it establishes. I think he's so, you know, the critique of the subject is so profound in Foucault that I just don't see how you get out of it. But anyway, that's just my take. I don't know, it might probably not satisfying. But this thing about, you know, I mean, we totally agree. When I speak about discourse as an overwhelming mechanism of social control, I'm criticizing that as a version, the kind of Althuserian left that came out of '68 and is trying to explain a failed revolution. And I'm absolutely, you know, this is one of my, you know, the sticks that I'm beating. This is why we disagree over here, because your analysis is a mixture of the Althusser and the historical materialism, right? I mean, you have both.
No,
you have both laid on top of one another.
No.
You know, and that's why we're reduced to this point where all we can do is be violent. I mean, that's what I understood from your presentation this morning, which is why we disagree. So, but the other thing about religion as a discourse of resistance, okay, well, we have to be super careful about that, because I mean, of course, religion can ground rights. I mean, it can. I mean, I think it's plausible to say, with a PhD student of mine, that you can write, for instance, the headscarf can be seen as a religious right. My personal freedom to choose what I wear, and it's my right, and I do it. Fine, it can be linked to a rights discourse, my cultural and religious right. Or there's a long tradition in Christianity of grounding, you know, rights. I mean, reason originally it comes from the divine, right? It doesn't. There are even versions of Islam where reason has a higher status, for instance, than it does in Aquinas. But you know, but religious discourse is one of resistance. I mean, it's very tricky. I mean, the very interesting constructive features of the of Shiism in the Iranian Revolution is partly the way there was a syncretism around revolutionary Marxism and Third Worldism and a kind of activist Shiism. And that was done by certain intellectuals like Ali Shariati. But it wasn't, you know, it was you could say religious discourse in a very, you know, a very generous way. But it was also a very particular instantiation, and it had a socio-economic content, and it had a political content. Whereas if you look at, so for instance, you know, the discourse of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in, say, 2011-12, and one doesn't want to, maybe it's not right to make this point in this context when this group has been violently repressed in savage ways since 2013, and tens of thousands are in prison and hundreds have been massacred. But it, the actual, the political content and the socio-economic content could be subject to some pretty severe critiques in terms of, you know, and that's before we even get on to Salafi Wahhabism and the sort of discourse propagated by ISIS, you know, misogynistic, sectarian, Manichaean, totally vacuous, world-rejecting. It's totally world-rejecting. No forms of political and social mediation, only the oneness of God. Everything is corrupt and sectarian, and, you know, and that comes from a long tradition of Salafi Wahhabism. I mean, it was a version of Islam that was completely rejected by the Islamic world between 1740s, when it was first propagated, and the 1920s, when you get little offshoots appearing in places like Egypt, when they start to say, okay, maybe we like this. But I mean, not surprisingly, Salafi Wahhabis declared jihad on every other Muslim. I mean, they make a specialism out of being sectarian and violent. So religion is resistance, well, up to a point. I mean, this concrete case study, the question of Tunisia since 2011. How do you include the Salafis within that constitutional dispensation when there's a complete rejection of the idea of a constitution coming from the, it's very interesting, complex, agonism. Chalcraft's written interestingly about it, but it's not because the thing is, when you study this in the West, it becomes a question of minorities. It becomes a question of security paranoias. It becomes a question of the homeland security business. It becomes a question of imperialism and foreign invasions. And Islamophobia. It's a question of Islamophobia when you study it here in London. But when you study it in Cairo or Syria or Tunisia, it's different. Because especially these are Muslim majority societies. So the question of Islamophobia is totally different. So, but anyway, just to give an indicator on this issue of religious discourse and rights. The practical value of theorizing. Well, to think about what resistance would be and what those creative recombinations of heteronymous elements could be like, and how they could inform the contemporary practice of, in this particular case, transnational activism or popular politics, and how those articulations can be made. How have they been done in the past? How can they be done in the future? And it was very interesting, this case we heard this morning of the Ghada movement about this extensive diaspora. And I wanted to ask, and I didn't, how did they articulate with non-Indians, and how did that happen if they did? Because you have Bahraini diaspora in London. For some reason, the Bahraini government always exiles them to London. And the British did it before them, and now they do it. Anyone who raises issues of human rights or representation, they get exiled to London. And they're all in London, and they're a diaspora. And they use a rights discourse, and there are religious articulations. But the extent to which can they articulate with the non-Bahrainis? There are some Arab circles they move in. There are some human rights NGOs. But there's that whole question of how do those things happen? How we can study how they happened in the past. How do they happen in the present? What are to identify the forces? I mean, someone mentioned reaction. The forces of, say, when it comes to the languages of that are associated with the elimination of rights. The idea that rights are a bad thing in themselves, ipso facto, like the sort of authoritarian languages that come out of the Egypt in the present, for instance, to identify them, to be able to spot them, to be able to know when the regime speaks about national security, we know it's about to do something particularly problematic. So the thing about historical materialism making something clear, I mean, it's no good if it makes it clear but it's reductive, or if it's wrong. It's just no good. I mean, you can have clarity, but if it's wrong, then it's bad clarity. I mean, this is a provocative example, but the two very worst things that have ever been said about the Nakba, the Palestinian dispossession of 1948-9, like, one comes from a Salafi and one comes from a Marxist. And the Marxist said, the Salafi said, this is Nasser ad-Din al-Albani, more Salafi than the Salafis, came from Damascus, went to Saudi Arabia, made a big splash. He said the Palestinians should leave the occupied territories and Palestine. They should leave because it's technically it's Dar al-Harb, so it's not fit for Muslims to live in. And he forgot, of course, about the Christians and everybody else, but he saw them all as Muslims. They should leave. And as you know, the whole Palestinian nationalist movement, including the Islamists and Hamas and everyone else, it's rooted in the idea of staying, not repeating 48, not being ethnically cleansed. You stick with it. I visited somebody the other day whose house is a Palestinian man. He's had this house since the 50s. It's between walls. The wall in Israel and Palestine. It's not one wall. It's lots of walls and fences and tunnels and bridges. This guy's house is between these walls and under them. He's still hanging in there. He will not budge. And he's completely surrounded. He has his own tunnel under the wall to get to his house. He's hanging in there. Anyway, Nasser ad-Din al-Albani, he said, no, they should all leave. And the Marxists said, the Nakba was good because it turned them into proletarians, which will make them more progressive. These are both very clear. They're very clear. They give us clarity, but they're also hugely violent. So anyway, that's provocative. Obviously, just finally on Gramsci. Yeah, I read Thomas. I read the Leninist materialist version of Gramsci. I think they might have the lion's share of the argument, right? I think that you might be right to say that Gramsci he's been appropriated in a cultural way. I mean, it's in so many academic literatures and in so many, he's been brought home to mother. But he's a revolutionary socialist, right? And the thing about the modern prince is, it does work a bit like a vanguard. It shakes contradictory consciousness. It shakes the common sense of the system. So maybe, but there are legitimate alternative, maybe minority interpretations of Gramsci that are more plural, and that's the one I cleave to, and I don't think it's a bad thing. But I take a point about Thomas. But I would also mention, don't forget Michel Filippini, who I met. He only writes in Italian, but he's ready to speak in a relatively plural way about Gramsci, and he's one of these Gramsciologists, and he's also a revolutionary socialist, but he doesn't necessarily. Raymond Williams, I love Raymond Williams. I love his definition of hegemony. I think of it all the time. I mean, it's the most non-reductive version that you can think of. I mean, the problem about Raymond Williams doesn't say much about imperialism, but I'm all in favour. But the civil and political society, it's a big debate, but I don't see civil society in this way of it being, it's a terrain of struggle. It's not a site of autonomy. And so, but I do see in the present conjuncture the use of making the distinction. I do see it as interesting. I mean, just now in Tunisia, you have people, for their sins, who decide to stick in civil society, as they call it, rather than political society, because they believe political society is corrupt. So they stay in civil society. I mean, that's how they frame it. But then there are all sorts of problems with civil society. International donors, professionalisation, lack of a popular base, depoliticisation. But that doesn't mean that, I find it a useful sort of distinction. But I know, it's a very vexed terrain.
Right, another round of questions. Yes, Bob. Two there. Okay, let's take these three and then we have more time. Bob, you want to start first?
If this is an irrelevant question, just don't bother with it, because there'll be better questions. But do you want to make a claim, a really broad epistemological claim, about the impossibility of knowing what's going to work, full stop, or do you want to limit that to resistance? Is it simply something about the notion of resisting conditions, which means that we, in your view, somehow can't know in advance, we can only know what's not going to work, maybe, sort of? Or do you want to say that actually all knowledge claims in the area of politics are fundamentally negative? We can know what's not the case, but we can't know what happens next because, and then there's a story about radical contingency or some such set of phrases.
I'm sort of struggling to understand what you mean exactly when you say, when you refer to historical materialism as reductionist, because it sort of comes across as if you are providing a version, sort of monolithic, homogenizing account of historical materialism. And the second thing I want to refer to is you refer to transnational activism as an articulation of social work, political logics. And here I'm going to refer to bits of Moroccan history, the 1958-1959 Reef Revolt, and how that's now grown into social movements. And there are different transnational actors within the diaspora, and how within those transnational actors, people tend to view these actions within the structure of neoliberalism, which you refer to. So my question would be, how would the social and political logics translate into the way individual transnational actors see each other within the international context?
And one more question.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I was actually wondering if you have ever come across Cultural Political Economy by Jessup and Son, because I'm working a lot with it, and it had, to me, some resemblances, and maybe you could explain a little bit how you would see it.
Yeah. Okay. Am I saying making a broad claim about the impossibility of knowing in advance what's going to work? Yes, sort of, but not quite. Yes, but not quite. But it's just that. See, one of the big frustrations of that I have, and the reason I don't call myself the big frustration I have with social movement theory is that what they have is for the most part, at least in the classical version, you have a whole bunch of grievances which are sort of ubiquitous, and then there's all these intervening variables which convert that into collective action. So it could be mobilizing structures, could be giving opportunities and incentives, could be strategic frames and all that, and that there's a sort of intervene, and we don't have to worry too much about grievances. But so my bugbear about that is that we certainly do have to worry about grievances. And there's people in social movement theory who look at that too, because there is a predictability around things like if you suppress the Kurds or if you suppress the Palestinians, you should anticipate resistance. I mean, this has been happening since, in the Kurdish case, since the 20s, and in the Palestinian case, since the 1870s. I mean, I think it's like, the sun rises every day. There's going to be resistance. This is about national rights, and in a particular context. It's not that we can't go, oh my goodness, we can't, all those intervening variables have to be there, else, resistance is never going to happen. We can predict. I mean, there are ways of predicting. If you constantly beat people because of the colour of their skin, at some point you'll probably find resistance. So I see that in terms of the contraction of forms of domestic hegemony. You have people lose their stakes that bind them to existing political structures. Social and economic logics come into contradiction with those structures. So that you can predict in this sense of something's going to happen, but then the actual combination which puts together those disincorporated heteronymous elements, we don't know what that'll be. So it's a bit like, I mean I'm not a huge fan of Said. Al-Juman is an interesting, he's an accomplished academic in the Middle East. He just says history is open-ended in a recent book on the Arab uprising. Yeah, it's open-ended in that sense. You can destructure, create situations where there's destructure, which then new combinations are probably going to arise, but we don't know what they are in advance. And that's where the kind of the sort of omniscience and the authoritarianism of hindsight and the know-it-all, hindsight is 20/20 comes in. You get this thing about people either definitely knew it was going to happen, but they only say that in advance, or they say it like a stop clock. They're right because they've been saying it for 30 years. So I think that's all. So the idea being that then we have to expect to be surprised, is the way I put it, but not perpetually so, meaning there are certain predictable situations where, but for instance, I was surprised about Egypt because, when in Algeria in 91 too, when the military crushed the elections and smashed the Sunni modernist FIS party, there was a civil war. And I suppose I thought to myself, and that had also happened in Syria, really. There was an armed struggle when Assad, the senior, crushed the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. But then, so they went into an armed struggle in 79, and then they were crushed in 82. So I sort of expected after the coup in Egypt that after the crushing of the democratically elected president, the massacres, that there would be some sort of armed struggle. But the surprise was the Muslim Brotherhood did not pick up arms. And that's the real surprise. It's not that, oh my God, they're all terrorists. It's that they didn't pick up arms. So that surprised me a bit. Maybe someone else was more clairvoyant about that. But I really thought that there was... But then, there's ways to explain it again retrospectively in more deterministic ways. But that just makes the point. We can't... It's tricky to predict, even in situations of destructure, what new whether there would be a combination. But there's no alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Salafi Wahhabis in Sinai. I mean, they hate each other. Okay, what do I mean by the reductionist version of historical materialism? Well, it's about the materialism, the modernist teleology, the ascription of agency and historicity to the capitalist system alone. It's like the only way the Middle East becomes historical is through entering the cosmos of capitalism. I mean, that's the only way it can become historical. Otherwise, it's vegetative, superstitious, it's something other. And, don't forget the Asian mode of production. I know Marx didn't say Asian mode of production, but that came out of his thought. It just repeats itself. It isn't historical. It's not historical until capitalism comes along. So how do you have historical agency? How do you think of historical agency and without succumbing to that sort of Eurocentrism that's associated with the discourse of capitalism? So there's a big debate about this between Edwin Said and Hajiz Ahmad, but that's my take on it. I did publish on that in about 2005. But in terms of the RIF, yes, do you mean like solidarity organisations in Britain, because they are socialist, they invite RIF trade unionists and others, and they say, "Oh, you're fighting against neoliberalism. We want to hear from you." And yeah, that does happen. But then you have to it depends. It could lead to an interesting deliberative process where people learn, right? Or it could lead to a kind of a sabotage of what the RIF are doing, because it might mean that they're being directed to something that they didn't mean and that they don't have in mind. So that relationship could exist. Or you could have, but this is a very specific, very small world, and I do know something about it. And I think there's some interesting transnational things going on in this regard. And then there's a whole Moroccan diaspora in London who sort of activated, isn't it, after 2011, and they became associated. They started to become interested in transnational forms in a way that didn't exist before. So I think it's complex, but there's surely interesting things being done. And as for Bob Jessup, I thought that was very interesting. I did read some of his stuff on cultural political economy, but my memory of it is that it doesn't really. Does it advance the debate about resistance? Really, it's more of a sort of structuralist, sort of systemic type of construction. That was my vague impression. But I mean, it looks terribly interesting, and I'm sympathetic to this idea of putting those logics together and trying to put, in general. But I didn't think he had much to say about resistance and transformation. Is that right?
That's what I'm now trying to.
Okay.
Okay. We have, if you are prepared to go another 5 minutes over time, we can take another round of questions.
Hi, thanks so much. There was one point in your presentation when you talked about resistance or the breakup of a regime couldn't come from within. And what struck me about that was not only the logical, but also the example you used was Egypt. And as a sort of full self-disclosure, from 2010 to 2015, I was an assistant professor at the American University in Cairo. So I went through this whole process of living parts of what you're talking about. And it's always struck me that, and I mean this with all due respect, that when I come back to Europe and hear Western-based academics talk about it, or people in Western media, it bears almost zero relation to what was happening on the ground, so to speak, for example. And you see the power of the media to create that discourse based on its own desires, or whatever you want to call it, but also the narrative that's created from that. And one of the things to link the two pieces together, there's many different parts of that, but one of the things I wanted to link together was, you didn't talk, at the very end you mentioned the military, but what you didn't mention was the power struggles that were taking place at the top of the regime between, for example, the Mubarak family and the military generals, because what was happening was that Mubarak, he was old, wants to retire, for example, his wife Susanna wants his son, Gamal, to take power from him. But the problem is Gamal is not a military man. And ever since 52, it's always been the military, and specifically the army, that's come to power there. So what you had was, yes, you had an attempted liberalisation of the Egyptian economy based on the IMF, World Bank, American government, and so on and so forth, but you also had that power structure. Now, if you run with that idea, where at the top of the regime you've got that problematic structure, the military owns 40%-ish of the GDP, it doesn't want to lose its power base based on getting this guy to come into power, then what you've got is a split in the regime that leads to that moment where you can railroad through it, so that what would previously have happened, the regime previously would just have smashed the resistance. It now no longer is able to do that because it's got a moment of hesitation, it's got a moment of discord, if you like, at the very, very heart of that regime. And what that means then is that within the regime itself, you have the change, or you have the conditions of that change itself. And it seems that that part, if you run with that narrative, that part of change can't come from within is just obliterated.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't mean to say change couldn't come from within. I didn't mean to say that at all. I don't know when that popped up in the talk. I mean, I know I talked fast and I probably didn't communicate very well, but no, I certainly didn't mean to say that at all. On the other side, yes, I mean, what you say is quite well covered in the literature and answer. I mean, I sort of thought, maybe just my history from below bias, I thought people made too much of that. I mean, there's a lot of it. I mean, I can give you a long reading list on the role of the military in the Arab uprisings. There's a lot of stuff on coup-proof, all those relationships, and Springborg, and Lutterbeck, and all these people have written on that. So I thought what you said, Sam. But so I didn't quite see how it linked to your point about the West and Western academics and Western media, because it's quite well covered in the West.
In that case, that's all we have time for. And there's Steve.